Cornelius Vanderbilt built the modern world. He owned the railroads. He owned the ships. He owned the politicians. But in the winter of 1877, the most powerful man in America was not fighting a business rival. He was fighting the dead. Witnesses claimed the Commodore spent his final nights screaming at empty chairs. They said he summoned spirits for stock tips. They said he used electricity to cure his rotting organs. When he finally died, the world waited for the distribution of his $100 million empire. They expected a legacy. They got a curse. The Commodore left 95% of the fortune to one son. To the others, he left an insult. But the children did not accept the defeat. They launched the most scandalous lawsuit in American history. Their argument was simple. Their father wasn't just cruel. He was legally insane. What followed was a trial that dragged the Vanderbilt name through the mud. It exposed the seances. It exposed the madness. It asked a question that terrified every rich family in New York. Is extreme greed a form of mental illness? The Vanderbilt trial was not merely a legal dispute over a bank balance. It was the definitive autopsy of the Gilded Age. In 1877, the United States was fractured. The country was in a deep economic depression. Children were starving in the tenements of 5 Points, freezing to death in the streets. Yet just a few miles uptown, the Vanderbilts were dining off gold plates and feeding liver to their dogs. The tension was suffocating. The public hated the robber barons, but they were obsessed with them. When the trial began, the curtain was finally pulled back. For 18 months, the New York Tribune and the New York Times published the daily court transcripts on the front page, pushing news of the Civil War reconstruction to the sidelines. The trial asked a question that terrified the industrial elite. Does accumulating absolute power require absolute madness? The defense claimed the Commodore was a genius who built the nation. The prosecution claimed he was a raving lunatic who didn't know his own children. The verdict would not just decide who got the money. It would determine if American law protected the rights of a family or the will of a tyrant. To understand the war, you must fear the warrior. Cornelius Vanderbilt was not born into the silk sheets of Manhattan society. He was born in 1794 on a rocky dirt farm in Staten Island. The son of a poor ferryman, he was an illiterate brawler. Records suggest he never read a book in his life. Yet he memorized the price of every commodity in New York Harbor. He was a force of nature. At age 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother to buy a small sailing barge called a periauger. He didn't just work, he hunted. He ferried passengers through storms that kept other captains in the dock. He undercut prices until his rivals went bankrupt. He physically fought competitors on the decks of his ships. By 1877, this rough, spitting, cursing sailor owned the New York Central Railroad, the iron spine of the American economy. He possessed one out of every $9 in circulation. But he had not become a gentleman. He remained a street fighter in a tailored suit. He viewed human beings, including his own children, as employees. And employees could be fired. The Commodore was not merely wealthy. He was a hoarder of power. In the late 19th century, a new idea called philanthropy was spreading among the elite. Tycoons like Peter Cooper were building schools and libraries for the public. Vanderbilt viewed this as weakness. He believed that money was a weapon, and one does not give their weapon to the enemy. He famously remarked, "If I had learned education, I would not have had time to learn anything else." His philosophy was simple: competition is war. When a former business partner tried to seize control of his steamship line while he was on vacation, Vanderbilt did not file a lawsuit. He did not call the police. He wrote a letter that became a legend of American capitalism. It read, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I will not sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you." And he did. He dropped his prices to zero, starved them of customers, and bought their bankrupt assets for pennies. He applied this same brutal efficiency to everything in his life. He believed that if you could not defend your territory, you deserved to lose it. Unfortunately, he applied this logic to his own children. The mansion at 10 Washington Place was not a home, it was a barracks. Inside the red brick walls, the Commodore demanded the same absolute obedience he received from his ship captains. Dinner was served at a precise hour. Conversation was forbidden unless initiated by the father. The silence was heavy. The Commodore had 13 children with his first wife, Sophia, but records suggest he viewed them largely as livestock to be managed. He ruled with a strap in one hand and a Bible in the other. But the terror went deeper than physical punishment. The Commodore used the threat of insanity as a method of control. When his wife, Sophia, the woman who had borne his 13 children, objected to moving the family into Manhattan, he did not argue with her. He had her committed to a mental asylum. He forced her to stay there until she learned obedience. This was the lesson the children learned early. To defy the father was not just rebellion, it was madness. And madness was punished with exile. The children grew up walking on eggshells, knowing that one wrong word could erase their existence. If the Commodore was a lion, his eldest son William was a sheep. Known as Billy, he was overweight, slow-talking, and anxious. He was the antithesis of everything his father respected. The Commodore did not hide his disgust. He called Billy a blockhead and a blatherskite in front of business associates. He told friends that Billy had no more sense than a cow. For the first 40 years of his life, Billy was treated not as an heir, but as a failure. The Commodore exiled him to a small, rundown farm on Staten Island, telling him to make it work or starve. It was a test. Billy didn't starve. He worked the soil with his own hands. He pinched every penny. He became a boring, methodical, penny-pinching farmer. He did exactly what he was told. He swallowed the insults. He swallowed the rage. He turned himself into a mirror of his father's greed, just to earn a nod of approval. He waited 40 years for the throne, terrified that at any moment the old man would change his mind, and he had good reason to worry. Then there was the other son, Cornelius Jeremiah, known to the press and the public simply as Cornel. If William was the plodding plow horse, Cornel was the wild, uncontrollable stallion. He was everything his father was not: charming, witty, and socially magnetic. He was the only man in New York who could make the Commodore laugh, but he possessed two fatal flaws that turned his father's grudging love into a cold, hard hatred. First, Cornel was a compulsive gambler. The addiction consumed him entirely. He spent his nights in the smoke-filled gambling dens of Lower Manhattan, betting money he didn't have on cards and roulette. He famously bet his own gold cufflinks on a single hand of poker when his pockets were empty. He forged his father's signature on high-interest loans, creating scandals that the Commodore had to pay to hush up. But his second flaw was physical. Cornel was an epileptic. In the ignorant medical landscape of the 1870s, epilepsy was not treated with compassion. It was viewed with deep suspicion, often linked to demonic possession or moral weakness. The Commodore watched his son suffer violent seizures and saw only a defect. He called him a blatherskite and a lunatic. To the titan of industry, a son who could not control his own body was a broken machine. And in the Vanderbilt philosophy, broken machines were not fixed. They were discarded. The Commodore's solution to Cornel's problems was not medicine, compassion, or therapy. It was incarceration. The relationship between father and son descended into a cycle of brutality that shocks modern historians. On multiple occasions, when Cornel's debts became too high, the Commodore didn't pay them. He had his own son arrested. But arrest was the light punishment. When Cornel refused to stop gambling, the Commodore used his immense political influence to have him committed to the Bloomingdale Lunatic Asylum. He locked his son away behind iron bars, claiming it was for his own moral correction. When Cornel was finally released, he was not welcomed home. He was exiled. The Commodore banished him to a desolate farm in Hartford, Connecticut, far from the temptations of the city. He was placed on a strict, humiliating allowance, barely enough to buy food, while his father sat on a pile of $100 million just a few hours away. The Commodore's letters from this period are cold and terrifying. In one famous note, he told Cornel, "I would rather see you dead than see you waste my money." This was the dynamic in 1876. A son who had been locked in a cage, starving for a penny, waiting for the old man to die so he could finally be free. If the sons were targets of active abuse, the daughters were ghosts. The Commodore had 8 daughters. In the strict hierarchy of the Vanderbilt Empire, they ranked somewhere below the household servants. The Commodore was a man of the 19th century in the most extreme misogynistic sense. He believed women were biologically incapable of handling finance, business, or serious thought. He viewed his daughters strictly as liabilities, mouths to feed until they could be married off to other men and become someone else's problem. He rarely spoke to them at dinner. He never consulted them on business matters. When they asked for money for clothes or travel, he gave them pennies and lectured them on the virtues of thrift. One daughter, Mary LaBeau, was different. She watched her father's cruelty with a simmering, quiet rage. She watched him give Billy responsibility. She watched him abuse Cornel. And she realized with growing horror that when the end came, she would likely be erased from the ledger entirely. The daughters were not expected to fight. They were expected to mourn quietly in black veils and disappear into history. The Commodore made a fatal calculation. He underestimated the anger of a child who has been ignored for 40 years. By the winter of 1876, the Titan began to crumble. The Commodore was 82 years old, an ancient age for the time. His body, once strong as iron and capable of fighting men half his age, was finally failing. His kidneys were rotting. His stomach was in revolt, plagued by peritonitis. He spent his days trapped in a dark room on the second floor of the mansion, screaming in pain and barking orders at nurses who were terrified of him. But as his physical health declined, the atmosphere in the house shifted dramatically. The vultures began to circle. Family members who hadn't visited in years suddenly appeared in the parlor, asking politely about his condition. They weren't worried about his health, they were worried about the paperwork. William stood guard at the bedroom door like a sentinel. He controlled who got in and who stayed out. The daughters claimed that William was isolating the old man, whispering poison into his ear, ensuring that when the final signature was written, only one name would remain. The house was no longer a home, it was a waiting room for death. Filled with the stench of medicine and greed. The end came in January 1877. The scene inside the bedroom was a bizarre mixture of tragedy and farce, proving that money cannot buy dignity. Records suggest the Commodore refused conventional medicine in his final days. Instead, the room was filled with magnetic healers and spiritualists. He believed that electricity could restart his organs. He had magnets placed under his mattress. He shouted at invisible business partners in the corner of the room. The doctors called it delirium. The Commodore called it a board meeting with the dead. In his final lucid moments, he did not ask for his daughters. He asked for a hymn. He sang, "Come, ye sinners, poor and needy." It was a strange, ironic request from a man who had been a sinner his entire life and never helped the needy. At 10:51 a.m., the singing stopped. The doctors checked for a pulse. There was none. The Titan was dead. William walked to the window and signaled to the reporters waiting in the snow. The news wire flashed across the world. Vanderbilt is gone, but the chaos was just beginning. The funeral was a spectacle of black velvet and cold silence. The body lay in state in the parlor, dressed in his finest suit, while the city outside ground to a halt. New York City shut down completely. The stock exchange closed, a rare honor usually reserved for presidents. Steamships in the harbor lowered their flags. The streets were lined with thousands of people, shivering in the cold, hoping to catch a glimpse of the grief of the richest family in America. But inside the carriages, there was no grief. There was calculation. The family rode to the cemetery in the Moravian church on Staten Island. The ride was silent and tense. Cornel sat opposite William. The daughters sat opposite their husbands. Eyes were averted. They were not thinking about the father they had lost. They were thinking about the document locked in the safe. They were doing the math. The funeral was simply a formality, a public show. The real event was yet to come. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the family alliance fractured. The truce was over. A few days later, the family gathered in the library at 10 Washington Place. The room was warm, smelling of leather and cigar smoke, but the air was freezing. This was the moment of truth. The lawyer, Charles Rapallo, stood behind the heavy oak desk holding a sealed envelope. The atmosphere was suffocating. William sat near the front, impassive, like a stone statue. Cornelius sat near the back, twitching, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The daughters sat in a row, rustling in their black mourning dresses. They expected a standard division. In 1877, it was customary for a wealthy man to leave half to his wife and divide the rest among the children. They expected millions. They had already mentally spent the money. The lawyer broke the wax seal. The sound of the paper tearing was the loudest noise in the room. He adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and began to read. No one in that room was prepared for the numbers they were about to hear. The lawyer cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the mahogany-lined library as everyone leaned forward in anticipation. As the seal of the will was finally broken, the atmosphere shifted from mere curiosity to a heavy, suffocating dread. The lawyer began to read the numbers with a cold precision, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped in the mansion. The estate was valued at over $100 million, an almost incomprehensible sum in 1877 that represented 1 out of every $9 in circulation. To the daughters and the black sheep son, Cornelius, the distribution seemed obvious. They expected a fair, if not equal, division of the spoils after a lifetime of fear. But as the words left the lawyer's mouth, the temperature in the room turned icy. The Commodore had not divided his empire. He had consolidated it into a single fist. Aside from a few relatively minor bequests to his wife and a pittance for his daughters, the staggering bulk of the fortune, $95 million, was left to one man, William Henry Vanderbilt. The Blockhead, the blatherskite, the son who had spent 40 years as his father's punching bag, was now the richest person on the planet. It was a bombshell that didn't just rattle the windows, it leveled the entire family foundation. The Commodore had ensured his railroad empire stayed under a single hand, but in doing so, he had effectively declared a total war on the rest of his own bloodline. The silence that followed the reading of the $95 million bequest was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, crushing the air out of the lungs of everyone present in that library. For several long, agonizing seconds, no one moved, no one breathed, and no one dared to speak. The shock was so total and so sudden that it bordered on physical paralysis for the children who had been bypassed. Cornelius sat in the back of the room, his face draining of all color, until he resembled a ghost in a mourning suit, his hands trembling visibly as they gripped the velvet upholstery. He had lived his life on the edge of financial ruin, always buoyed by the secret certainty that his father's death would bring a deluge of gold to finally pay off his many debts. Now, he was looking at an inheritance that was little more than a humiliating monthly allowance, a leash held by the very brother he had mocked. The daughters were equally stunned, their minds racing through the years of forced obedience and the endless insults they had endured, all for a payoff that would barely cover the upkeep of a single Manhattan mansion. The realization was beginning to set in with a cold, hard clarity. They had been deleted from the dynasty. They weren't just disappointed, they were publicly humiliated in front of the entire world. The Commodore had used his final words on Earth to tell them they were worthless. As the initial paralysis faded, it was replaced by a simmering, white-hot fury that promised to burn the Vanderbilt name to the ground. If the sons felt betrayed by the numbers, the daughters felt completely erased by the legacy. In the rigid social structure of the 1870s, a woman's standing was entirely dependent on the wealth of her father or husband, and the Commodore had effectively stripped them of their status in one stroke. He had left his daughters amounts ranging from $200,000 to $500,000. To the average working-class New Yorker struggling in the tenements, this was a king's ransom. But to a Vanderbilt daughter, it was a deliberate and public slap in the face. They had grown up in the immense shadow of a man who owned the very air they breathed. And now they were being told that their entire lives were worth less than a few miles of railroad track. Mary Alicia LaBeau, the most outspoken and resilient of the sisters, looked at her brother William with a gaze that could have withered iron. She knew that this was not about the money itself, but about the cruel message of dominance behind it. Their father had viewed them as secondary players in a male-dominated game of power, and he had used his will to ensure they stayed in their place long after he was gone. The anger was not just about the loss of luxury, it was about the total loss of agency. They were being forced to live on the charity of a brother who had always looked down on them with silent judgment. In that library, the ghosts of the family finally found their voices, and those voices were screaming for vengeance. The funeral flowers were barely wilted before the disinherited children began to organize their counterattack. That night, far from the prying eyes of the tabloid press and the watchful, suspicious sentinel that was William, an unholy alliance was born in the shadows of the city. Cornelius, desperate and facing the very real and terrifying threat of debtor's prison, met with his sisters in a secret summit of the wronged. They were a motley crew of the neglected, fueled by a shared, burning hatred for the brother who had suddenly taken everything. They knew that challenging a will in 1877 was an uphill battle of impossible proportions, especially when the testator was the most powerful and influential man in American history. But they also knew that they had one secret advantage: the Commodore's own legendary eccentricity. They didn't need to prove the will was a simple mistake. They needed to prove it was the diseased product of a broken and manipulated mind. They formed a solemn pact, pledging their remaining resources and their very reputations to a singular, destructive goal: the total annihilation of the Commodore's final testament. They would sue to have the will set aside on the high-stakes grounds of undue influence and testamentary incapacity. It was a suicide mission for their social standing, but they felt they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The fragile truce that had held the family together during the Commodore's life was officially dead. The Vanderbilt Civil War had begun in earnest. To fight a war of this magnitude against the richest man in the world, the siblings needed more than just anger. They needed the most ruthless and theatrical legal minds in New York. They went after the dream team of the 19th century courtroom, men who were as much performers as they were attorneys. The alliance hired Scott Lord and Henry Clinton, masters of the high-stakes legal game. These were lawyers who understood that a trial of this scale and public interest would not be won by dryly citing statutes, but by swaying the hearts and minds of the public and the press. They were experts in the theatrical cross-examination, known for their ability to make even the most composed and powerful witness crumble under the pressure of the spotlight. On the other side, William Henry Vanderbilt spared no expense in his defense, hiring the legendary Charles Rapallo and a fleet of elite advocates to protect his $95 million. The legal fees alone were enough to bankrupt a minor city, but the stakes were the survival of the entire Vanderbilt railroad empire. The lawyers on both sides began sharpening their blades, scouring the Commodore's long and colorful past for every scandal, every hallucination, and every moment of senile weakness they could find. It was to be a battle of the titans, played out in the courtroom of the surrogate, with the eyes of the entire world watching as the best legal minds money could buy prepared to tear a family's dirty laundry into tiny, public shreds. The strategy of the contestants was as brilliant as it was brutal. They were going to put the Commodore's sanity on a public trial for the world to see. They knew they couldn't win by simply arguing that the will was unfair. The law allowed a man to be as mean as he wanted with his own money. Instead, they had to prove that Cornelius Vanderbilt was a raving lunatic at the precise moment he signed the document. They focused their attack on his secret obsession with the supernatural, a dark corner of his life that he had mostly kept hidden from his business rivals. The lawyers planned to parade a series of spiritualists, mediums, and magnetic quack healers before the court to testify about the Commodore's bizarre belief that he was communicating with the dead. They would tell sensational stories of the Titan sitting in darkened rooms, asking ghosts for stock tips and railroad merger advice. They would argue that he was not a man of cold, hard logic, but a man under the undue influence of spirits and charlatans who had rotted his judgment. By painting the Commodore as a man whose mind had been decayed by dementia and superstition, they hoped to convince the judge that the will was not a deliberate choice, but the hallucination of a dying madman. It was a high-risk gamble that threatened to turn the legendary Vanderbilt name into a national joke for generations to come. The news of the Vanderbilt will contest hit the streets like a tidal wave, instantly transforming a private family tragedy into the most scandalous public spectacle of the 19th century. In an era before radio or television, the newspapers were the only source of entertainment, and the Great Will case was the ultimate long-running soap opera. The New York Times, the New York Tribune, and the New York World engaged in a brutal circulation war, each racing to publish the most sensational details of the Commodore's private life. Reporters were stationed around the clock at the courthouse and the Washington Place mansion, desperate for even a scrap of gossip about the family's internal rot. The public's appetite for the trial was insatiable. Working-class New Yorkers who had lived under the thumb of the Commodore's railroad monopoly now delighted in seeing his dirty laundry aired in public. Every morning, thousands of people crowded the sidewalks just to catch a glimpse of the legal teams or the black-veiled daughters as they entered the courtroom. The trial pushed news of the Civil War's lingering reconstruction and international politics to the back pages. It was more than a legal battle, it was a cultural phenomenon that exposed the deep-seated resentment the public felt toward the robber barons, proving that the wall of wealth could not protect a family from the prying eyes of a nation hungry for a scandal. When the trial finally commenced in the surrogate's court, the air in the packed gallery was electric with anticipation. The legal battle lines were drawn with surgical precision, presenting two fundamentally different versions of the same man. Scott Lord, the lead counsel for the disinherited siblings, opened with a devastating portrait of a man in total mental collapse. He argued that the Commodore's legendary business acumen had been replaced by a senile, flickering mind that was easily manipulated by the one son who remained at his side. Lord's strategy was to paint the will not as a document of intent, but as the incoherent rambling of a dying madman who was no longer capable of recognizing his own kin. On the other side, the defense, led by the meticulous Henry Clinton, presented a starkly different narrative. They portrayed Cornelius Vanderbilt as a titan whose mind remained as sharp and ironclad as his railroads until his final breath. They argued that the will was a brilliant act of corporate preservation, intended to keep the empire intact rather than scattering it among children who had proven themselves incapable of managing wealth. This was the central conflict that would dominate the next 18 months. Was the Commodore a visionary genius or a raving lunatic? The fate of $100 million rested on the answer. The most explosive and bizarre evidence presented by the contestants focused on the Commodore's lifelong secret obsession with the supernatural world. To a 19th-century public that viewed Vanderbilt as the pinnacle of hard-headed, realistic capitalism, the revelations about his belief in spiritualism were nothing short of shocking. The lawyers for the disinherited children began to weave a narrative of a man who lived in two worlds, the physical world of steam and steel, and a shadow world of ghosts and whispers. They presented evidence that the Commodore had spent decades seeking guidance from the great beyond, convinced that the dead held the secrets to success in the living world. He was a man who didn't just read the stock tickers, he consulted with the spirits of his dead mother and deceased business rivals before making major financial decisions. This wasn't merely a hobby or a Victorian curiosity. It was a deep-seated delusion that his children argued had eventually rotted his ability to distinguish reality from hallucination. By bringing these private seances into the harsh light of the courtroom, the legal team hoped to prove that the Commodore's entire reality had been warped by a monomania for the spirit world. They argued that a man who took business advice from ghosts was, by definition, legally incompetent to dispose of an earthly fortune. The courtroom was mesmerized as witness after witness described the bizarre seances that took place within the darkened parlors of the Vanderbilt mansion. The contestants, called professional mediums and spiritualist interpreters, who testified that the Commodore was one of their most frequent and fervent clients. The stories were sensational. The richest man in the world sitting in a circle, holding hands with strangers, and waiting for spirit rappings on the mahogany table to tell him when to sell New York Central stock. One particularly damning testimony described how Vanderbilt attempted to contact the spirit of Jim Fisk, a former rival he had ruined in life, seeking his advice on a massive railroad merger from beyond the grave. The lawyers argued that the Commodore was so deeply ensnared by these charlatans that he had lost all sense of agency. He wasn't the one making the decisions. The spirits, or rather, the mediums who spoke for them, were the ones drafting the future of the Vanderbilt empire. They claimed that these mediums had planted the seeds of distrust toward his daughters and his son Cornelius, whispering that they were unfriendly spirits who didn't deserve his gold. It was a picture of a man who, in his old age and fear of death, had handed the keys of his kingdom to the phantoms of his own imagination. Beyond the world of ghosts, the trial delved into the Commodore's desperate and dangerous attempts to stave off death through the use of quack medicine and magnetic healers. As his physical health failed, Vanderbilt grew increasingly paranoid and distrustful of legitimate doctors, turning instead to a series of eccentric charlatans who promised him eternal vigor through electricity. The courtroom heard testimony about magnetic doctors who were invited into the mansion to perform bizarre rituals, claiming they could pull the disease out of the Commodore's body through the use of raw electrical current and heavy magnets. One witness described how Vanderbilt had copper wires coiled around his bedposts and magnets placed under his pillow, convinced that the magnetic flow would restart his rotting kidneys and failing heart. He was a man who had conquered the continent with technology, but in his final days, he had become a victim of it, falling for every miracle cure and electrical gimmick sold by the 19th century equivalent of snake oil salesmen. The contestants argued that this reliance on quacks was the ultimate proof of his mental decay. A man of sound mind would have accepted his mortality. A madman would spend his fortune on magnets and lightning. They contended that this same lack of judgment had allowed William to step in and dictate the terms of the will while the Commodore was distracted by the hum of his own delusions. Cornelius Vanderbilt's obsession with the spirit world was not just a private eccentricity. It was fueled by two of the most scandalous women in 19th century America, Tennessee Claflin and Victoria Woodhull. These sisters, known as the Bewitching Brokers, managed to infiltrate the Commodore's inner circle by promising him both financial success through spiritual guidance and eternal youth through their presence. Claflin, in particular, became a frequent visitor to the Washington Place mansion, reportedly conducting seances where she channeled the spirits of dead tycoons to advise Vanderbilt on his railroad acquisitions. The trial laid bare the embarrassing details of this relationship, with the contestants arguing that the Commodore had become a helpless puppet in the hands of these charismatic sisters. They claimed that Tennessee Claflin didn't just provide spiritual comfort, she exercised a magnetic control over the aging Titan's mind, convincing him to distrust his own flesh and blood in favor of the voices she summoned from the shadows. The defense struggled to explain away the hundreds of thousands of dollars Vanderbilt had poured into the sisters' brokerage firm and their radical newspaper. To the public, it was the ultimate proof of senility. The man who once outsmarted every banker on Wall Street was now being outmaneuvered by a pair of self-proclaimed clairvoyants who sold him whispers of immortality. Perhaps the most surreal and haunting testimony of the entire trial concerned the Commodore's relationship with his own legacy, embodied in a massive bronze statue of himself. The contestants presented witnesses who claimed that in his final years, Vanderbilt's grasp on reality had slipped so far that he began to believe the statue, a centerpiece of his grand Hudson River Railroad terminal, was alive. Servants testified that the Commodore would often stand before his own likeness, speaking to the bronze figure as if it were a separate, more powerful version of himself. He would reportedly ask the statue for guidance on business mergers, convinced that the bronze Commodore possessed a wisdom that his failing human mind could no longer access. This statue delusion was used by the lawyers for the disinherited children to paint a picture of total mental disintegration. They argued that a man who could no longer distinguish between a work of art and a living person was fundamentally incapable of making rational decisions about the distribution of a $100 million estate. It was a chilling image for the jury, the titan of industry, isolated in his mansion, whispering his deepest fears and secrets to a cold metal version of his own ego, while the world outside continued to believe he was still the same iron-willed genius who had conquered the continent. The trial soon turned into a parade of the disgruntled, as the legal team representing the disinherited siblings called a long line of former maids, butlers, and valets to the stand. These were the people who had seen the Commodore not as a public legend, but as a frightened, failing old man behind closed doors. Their testimony was a brutal, unvarnished look at the internal rot of the Vanderbilt household. They spoke of terrifying outbursts of rage where the Commodore would scream at empty air, and of nights where he wandered the hallways of 10 Washington Place, brandishing a pistol and hunting for intruders that only he could see. One valet described a scene where Vanderbilt, convinced he was back on the deck of a steamship, began shouting orders to a phantom crew while standing in the middle of his library. The servants testified that the Commodore's legendary memory for numbers had vanished, replaced by a repetitive, obsessive focus on the spirits of his dead mother and deceased business rivals. The lawyers argued that this erratic behavior proved the Commodore was suffering from a profound and irreversible softening of the brain. By exposing the Titan's most humiliating moments through the eyes of those who served him, the contestants hoped to convince the court that the man who signed the will was not the Commodore at all, but a hollow, broken shell of the visionary he had once been. The momentum of the trial shifted dramatically when William Henry Vanderbilt finally took the stand in his own defense. Unlike the colorful mediums and disgruntled servants who had preceded him, William was a picture of calm, methodical precision. He knew that the entire fortune, $95 million, depended on his performance. With a voice that never wavered, he presented a narrative of a father who remained intellectually dominant until his final breath. William argued that the eccentricities described by his siblings were merely the quirks of a genius who had always walked a different path than common men. He testified that the Commodore's interest in spiritualism was a harmless intellectual curiosity rather than a disabling madness, and that the seances were simply a way for an old man to pass the time. Most importantly, William described his father's final business dealings, painting a picture of a man who was still making high-stakes decisions worth millions while on his deathbed. He portrayed himself not as a manipulative sentinel blocking his sister's access, but as a loyal son protecting a fragile titan from the greed of children who had never lifted a finger to help build the empire. William's testimony was designed to reassure the judge and the public that the Vanderbilt empire was in safe, rational hands. He was fighting for more than just money. He was fighting to prove that he was the rightful heir to the Commodore's throne. To counter the sensational stories of ghosts and statues, the defense legal team unleashed a weapon that was far more powerful in a court of law: the Commodore's own business records. They presented a mountain of ledgers, telegrams, and contracts signed by Vanderbilt in the very months and weeks leading up to his death. These documents told a story that completely contradicted the narrative of a raving lunatic. The records showed that even while he was supposedly talking to spirits and putting magnets under his pillow, Cornelius Vanderbilt was still managing the complex logistics of the New York Central Railroad with terrifying efficiency. He was still calculating interest rates, negotiating freight tariffs, and outmaneuvering rivals in a way that required a razor-sharp mind. The defense argued that it was impossible for a man to be insane for the purposes of a will while simultaneously being one of the most successful and rational businessmen on the planet. They contended that the Commodore's decision to leave the fortune to William was not an act of madness, but the most logical business decision of his life. He knew that only William had the patience and the discipline to keep the railroad empire from being torn apart by his siblings' debts and frivolous spending. These dry, ink-stained pages became the iron shield of the defense, arguing that a man's sanity should be judged by his results in the world of commerce, not by his private beliefs in the world of shadows. The core of the contestants' legal strategy was built upon the devastating claim of undue influence. Scott Lord and his team argued that during the Commodore's final months, a psychological Berlin Wall had been erected around his sickbed. They contended that William Henry Vanderbilt, along with the Commodore's young second wife, Frank, had intentionally isolated the aging Titan, whispering venom into his ears about the disinherited children. The lawyers presented a narrative where William acted as a shadowy puppet master, systematically cutting off communication between the Commodore and those who might have challenged William's dominance. They claimed that William had convinced his father that Cornelius was a hopeless degenerate, and that the daughters were greedy ingrates who only cared for his death. According to the prosecution, the will was not a reflection of the Commodore's true intent, but a script written by William and performed by a man whose cognitive defenses had been eroded by peritonitis and delirium. They argued that the Commodore was a prisoner in his own mansion, his mind a battlefield where William had successfully captured the high ground. To the siblings, $95 million was the bounty William had claimed for successfully brainwashing a dying man, turning a family legacy into a private inheritance through a campaign of psychological warfare and strategic silence. As the trial dragged into its second year, the courtroom in the surrogate's court became a theater of class war, and public sentiment began to shift in a way that terrified the Vanderbilt legal team. While the law focused on the dry details of testamentary capacity, the public was captivated by the visceral drama of the poor sisters versus the greedy heir. Working-class New Yorkers, many of whom struggled to earn a single dollar a day, were horrified to hear testimony about $95 million being hoarded by one man while his own sisters were treated like beggars. The newspapers, sensing the public's appetite for social justice, began to portray the daughters as tragic victims of a Gilded Age monster. Mary Alicia Labow became an unlikely folk hero, a woman standing up to the most powerful corporation in America for her right to be recognized. The crowd in the gallery, often filled with people who had no connection to the family, began to openly boo William when he entered the courtroom and cheer for the contestants' lawyers. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a trial of the very concept of inherited wealth in a democratic society. The defense realized that while they were winning the logical argument in the judge's eyes, they were losing the battle for the Vanderbilt name on the streets. The family brand was becoming synonymous with greed and dysfunction, a stigma that no amount of railroad stock could ever truly erase. The turning point of the trial arrived not with a sensational ghost story or a medical revelation, but with a shift in the tone of surrogate Delano Calvin himself. As the proceedings entered their final stages, the judge began to display a growing impatience with the sensationalism and the endless parade of spiritualist witnesses. He signaled that while the stories of magnetic healers and bronze statues were entertaining for the press, they did not meet the rigorous legal standard required to prove that a man was non compos mentis, not of sound mind. The legal reality began to eclipse the theatrical one. The defense's focus on the Commodore's continued business success was proving to be an impenetrable shield. The judge noted that the burden of proof lay entirely on the contestants, and proving that a man was eccentric was a far cry from proving he was insane. The realization began to dawn on Cornelius and his sisters that they were likely to lose the legal battle. Even if the Commodore was a believer in ghosts, the law generally protected a man's right to be as superstitious or as cruel as he wished with his own property. The sensationalism that had fueled their hopes was now working against them. As the case shifted from a circus of shadows back to a cold analysis of contract and intent, the siblings were winning the PR war, but they were staring into the abyss of a total legal defeat. William Henry Vanderbilt was a man who preferred the boardroom to the courtroom, and by late 1878, he had seen enough of the Vanderbilt name being dragged through the mud. Despite the defense legal team's confidence in a courtroom victory, William became increasingly panicked by the catastrophic damage to the family's reputation and the stability of the New York Central Railroad. The trial had caused the company's stock to fluctuate wildly, as investors worried about the potential for the empire to be broken up or tied up in appeals for a decade. More importantly, the constant newspaper headlines about the Vanderbilt madness were alienating the very social circles that William desperately wished to join. He realized that a total legal victory would be a hollow one if it meant he was the richest man in America, but also the most hated. In a calculated and pragmatic move, William reached out to his siblings with a quiet settlement proposal. He offered to stop the trial and pay out millions in additional bequests if the contestants would drop their claims and sign a document certifying their father's sanity. It was a classic business maneuver, paying hush money to buy back the family's dignity. For William, it was a necessary business expense. For the siblings, it was a lifeline that would finally allow them to exit the courtroom with their pockets filled and their long war at an end. The end of the trial of the century did not happen with a judge's gavel or a dramatic jury verdict, but with a series of quiet, tense meetings in the shadows of the mansion's library. The unholy alliance of the siblings, sensing that their legal momentum had stalled, agreed to William's settlement terms in early 1879. The numbers were staggering. Even as a settlement, William agreed to pay an additional $1 million to each of his sisters and roughly $200,000 to Cornelius, provided they remained silent for the rest of their lives. The backroom deal was a masterclass in Gilded Age pragmatism. William got the legal confirmation of the will he needed to protect the railroad empire, and the siblings got the wealth they had been fighting for since the old man's funeral. The legal fireworks show that had captivated the nation for 18 months was abruptly extinguished. The press was told the family had reconciled, but the reality was far colder. The settlement was a strategic truce, a massive transfer of cash used to bury the secrets of 10 Washington Place forever. While the public moved on to the next scandal, the Vanderbilt family retreated behind their new, even larger mansions. But the scars of the trial remained. They had won the war for the money, but the fragile bond of blood had been permanently traded for the cold security of railroad gold. The ink on the settlement papers represented a final, bitter redistribution of the Commodore's massive hoard. While the world saw a headline about family reconciliation, the reality was a surgical financial operation designed to end the war. Each of the 5 litigating sisters walked away with an additional $1 million, a sum that instantly elevated them to the highest tiers of American wealth, yet one that still felt like a consolation prize compared to the $95 million William retained. Cornelius, the son who had been the face of the rebellion, received enough to pay his mounting debts and a modest increase in his trust fund, but the fundamental power dynamic remained unchanged. William Henry Vanderbilt had successfully brought a permanent end to the public scrutiny of his father's sanity. He had effectively taxed his own inheritance to pay for the privilege of being the undisputed master of the New York Central Railroad. This new division of wealth was a masterstroke of crisis management. It satisfied the siblings' greed just enough to silence their testimony, while leaving the core of the Vanderbilt empire under a single unified command. It was a truce born of exhaustion and calculation, marking the moment when the Vanderbilt children realized that a shared million in hand was better than a lost $100 million in the hands of a judge. For Cornelius Jeremiah, the victory of the settlement was a hollow one that offered no real salvation. The money he won served only to highlight the emptiness of his life as the perpetual outcast. Despite his newfound wealth, the black sheep son remained a broken man, his body still ravaged by epilepsy, and his spirit crushed by the realization that even in death, his father had viewed him as a failure. Cornelius moved into a suite at the Glenham Hotel, but the gold did not bring him the respect he craved or the peace he needed. He became a ghost in his own city, a man who possessed a legendary name but no purpose. In April 1882, just 3 years after the trial ended, the weight of his father's shadow became unbearable. Cornelius locked the door to his hotel room and ended his own life with a single gunshot. His death was a tragic punctuation mark to the Great Will case, proving that the Commodore's cruelty had consequences that no settlement could ever erase. The public, who had once cheered for him as an underdog, quickly moved on, leaving Cornelius to be remembered as the son who fought for a fortune, only to find that it was a burden he was never meant to carry. William Henry Vanderbilt emerged from the trial as the richest man in the world, but the Blockhead was destined to enjoy his prize for only a fleeting moment. The stress of the 18-month legal war and the sudden, staggering responsibility of managing the nation's largest transportation empire took a devastating toll on his health. William lived in a state of constant anxiety, terrified that he would fail to live up to his father's impossible standards. He retreated into his massive mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue, surrounded by art he barely understood, and a family that was still fractured by the trial's scars. He famously remarked that he was not happy with his $95 million, claiming that the wealth brought nothing but trouble and the constant envy of others. In December 1885, only 8 years after his father's death, and 6 years after the settlement, William collapsed during a meeting in his study. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 64, having doubled the Vanderbilt fortune in his short reign, but losing his life to the exertion. The man who had been bullied for 40 years had finally achieved the throne, only to find that the seat was made of thorns. His death marked the end of the Vanderbilt's active era, and the beginning of an era defined by spending rather than earning. With the deaths of the two sons who had fought the war, the Vanderbilt fortune passed into the hands of the third generation, a group that had no memory of the Staten Island farm and no desire for the gritty world of railroad management. This was the era of the explosion of wealth, where the billions accumulated by the Commodore were transformed into the most extravagant display of luxury in human history. Led by William's children, including the ambitious Alva Vanderbilt and the architectural-obsessed Cornelius II, the family began a frantic race to build the grandest mansions on earth. They moved from the red brick townhouses of their father to the marble palaces of Newport and Fifth Avenue. The summer cottages like the Breakers and Marble House were not just homes, they were monuments of ego, costing millions to build and maintain. This generation viewed the family fortune as an inexhaustible fountain, using it to force their way into the highest circles of New York society and the European aristocracy. The trial was forgotten in a haze of champagne and gold leaf, as the Vanderbilts transitioned from the robber barons who built America to the celebrity elite who merely spent it. This was the peak of the Gilded Age, a time when a single family could outspend entire nations, unaware that the foundation of their power was already beginning to crack under the weight of their own excess. The erosion of the Vanderbilt millions did not happen overnight. It was a slow, spectacular leak that began precisely at the moment the family stopped working. While the Commodore had lived in relative simplicity and William had worked himself to death, the generations that followed viewed the fortune as a birthright that required no maintenance. They were practitioners of what economists call conspicuous consumption, spending millions on yachts that were used once a year and balls that lasted only a few hours. The family's influence over the New York Central Railroad began to fade as they sold off their voting stock to pay for their lifestyle and the crushing inheritance taxes of the new century. By the 1920s, the unity that the Commodore had tried to enforce with his consolidated will was completely gone. The family was now a collection of individuals with separate interests and competing debts, each draining their respective trust funds with little regard for the future. The trial had been the first sign of the rot, a public declaration that the Vanderbilts were a family of consumers rather than creators. As the Great Depression loomed, the mansions on Fifth Avenue were being torn down or sold to become museums, signaling the beginning of the end for the greatest dynasty the United States had ever seen. The gold was vanishing, traded for the fleeting glitter of social status and the cold comfort of empty palaces. In 1973, a historic gathering took place that would serve as the final, sobering postscript to the Vanderbilt saga. 120 descendants of the Commodore gathered at Vanderbilt University in Nashville for a family reunion. The event was organized to celebrate the legacy of the man who had once owned the very railroads that unified the American continent. However, as the champagne was poured and the introductions were made, a shocking economic reality became clear to the assembled press. Among those 120 direct heirs, there was not a single millionaire remaining. In just under a century, a fortune that was once greater than the gold reserves of the United States government had been completely and utterly liquidated. The $95 million that William Henry Vanderbilt had fought so hard to protect had vanished into a vortex of alimony, inheritance taxes, failed business ventures, and the relentless maintenance of empty palaces. The reunion was a gathering of ordinary people, doctors, teachers, and office workers, who possessed a legendary name but lived lives indistinguishable from the middle class they had once looked down upon. It was the ultimate proof that wealth is not a static object, but a living organism that requires the same iron will to maintain as it does to create. The Commodore's dynastic dream had died not with a bang, but with the quiet realization that his bloodline had finally rejoined the masses. The Vanderbilt will contest of 1877 did more than just settle a family feud. It fundamentally reshaped the American legal and cultural landscape regarding inheritance and the rights of the wealthy. The trial established a critical precedent for testamentary capacity, reinforcing the idea that a man's right to dispose of his property according to his own whims, no matter how eccentric or cruel, was nearly absolute under American law. It signaled to the other robber barons of the era that their consolidated empires could survive their deaths, provided they were careful in their planning and ruthless in their isolation of dissenting heirs. However, the trial also served as a dark warning about the Vanderbilt effect, the phenomenon where massive unearned wealth acts as a corrosive agent on the character and ambition of the next generation. It taught the nation that dynastic wealth is often a curse in disguise, stripping children of the necessity for struggle and leaving them vulnerable to the predatory interests of lawyers, charlatans, and their own worst impulses. The Gilded Age was defined by this tension between the creation of immense power and the inevitable dissipation that follows. The legal battle in the surrogate's court proved that while the law could protect the gold, it could not protect the family from the slow internal rot of entitlement. It remains the quintessential cautionary tale of the American dream gone wrong, where the pursuit of gold ultimately led to the impoverishment of the spirit. In the end, the Commodore's final victory was his ultimate defeat. He had succeeded in keeping his railroad empire consolidated under the hand of his chosen son, William. But in doing so, he had destroyed the very family he sought to elevate. The war that began in the Mahogany Library of 10 Washington Place did not end with the settlement of 1879. It continued to echo through the empty hallways of the Newport mansions and the tragic, lonely deaths of his descendants. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a man who believed he could control the world through the sheer force of his will, even from beyond the grave. He viewed the people in his life as chess pieces to be moved or discarded in a grand game of power, forgetting that humans are driven by emotions, anger, resentment, and a desperate need for recognition that no amount of gold can satisfy. Today, the names of the sisters who fought him and the son who committed suicide are mostly forgotten, while the Commodore's bronze statue continues to stare out over a city that has long since moved on from the era of steam and steel. The legacy of the Vanderbilt millions is not found in the bank accounts of his heirs, but in the ruins of the palaces they built and the legal records of the war they fought. It is a reminder that the greatest fortunes are built on a foundation of blood, and that eventually, time and greed will always find a way to turn the most powerful empire into dust. As the camera fades on the Commodore's cold metal eyes, we are left with the final realization that you can buy almost everything, but you can never buy peace. The story of the Vanderbilt inheritance is more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror held up to the American soul. Cornelius Vanderbilt spent 82 years building a wall of gold to protect his name, only to watch that same gold become the weapon his children used to tear each other apart. It serves as the ultimate reminder that while we can curate our estates and dictate our wills with iron precision, we cannot control the human heart from the grave. The Commodore's greatest failure was not a business deal. It was the belief that a family could be managed like a railroad. As we look back at the empty palaces of Newport and the tragic, lonely ends of the Vanderbilt heirs, we are forced to ask ourselves a difficult question about our own legacies. What are we truly leaving behind? We often obsess over the what, the assets, the accounts, and the physical markers of our success. But perhaps we should spend more time on the how. How we treated those closest to us. How we invested in the character of our children rather than just their bank balances. In the end, the only legacy that truly survives the passage of time is the love and values we weave into the lives of others. The gold eventually turns to dust, but a life lived with integrity remains unshakable. If you appreciated this unvarnished journey into the dark side of the Gilded Age, I invite you to join our community. Please hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that deep dive history still matters in an age of distractions. If you want to explore more stories of the world's greatest dynasties and the wars they fought behind closed doors, subscribe and join us every Sunday morning. I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. Which legendary family should we put under the microscope next? The Rockefellers? The Gettys? Or perhaps the tragic saga of the Astors? Your insights help us shape the future of this channel. Until next time, remember, you can buy the world, but you can never buy peace. Thank you for watching.